Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Riskologists. As always, I'm your host, Pat Bradshaw. Today, doing something slightly different. So absolutely delighted to be joined by not just one guest, but two. So firstly, delighted to introduce Deepak Mistry. So Dee, thanks a lot for coming on.
No problem.
Great stuff. And then secondly, again, it's my pleasure to introduce Richard Bendall-Jones. So Rich, again, thanks a lot for coming on.
You're welcome.
Brilliant. So, gents, I think a logical place to start with this, as I do with all the podcasts, is a little bit of a journey to date, really. So, just understanding really how you both got into risk management, a bit of a timeline of your career, and then your journeys leading up to this very point. So, Dee, would you like to kick us off?
Try not to make this too long. I've had a bit of a varied career, taken lots of twists and turns along the way.
Yeah.
I suppose where my career properly started off was back in 2001, where I joined National Grid. And the first team that I worked for was a risk modelling team within a strategy department. And the remit of the role was to try to help the teams optimise performance under a number of incentives by the regulator. And that basically involved doing sort of geeky things like statistical analysis, looking at multiple regression, correlation, time series, Monte Carlo, and the like. Bit of VBA programming as well. So it's quite a technical role, but it's quite broad reaching because we helped a number of internal clients sort of optimize their performance. And that included things like forecasting, producing scenarios, developing trading strategy models and the like. And then I kind of moved on after a few years of getting bored there, and I moved into I wanted to kind of go outside of my comfort zone a little bit, and I moved into a more engineering-focused department called Gas Network Investment. I was quite fortunate because now National Grid's quite a large organisation, so there are these opportunities available. And just ironically, the first job I got when I joined the team was to become an investment team leader to try and fix one of the worst corroded pipelines in the UK, a 42-kilometre stretch of gas, high-pressured pipeline. No pressure, no project management experience, but it was an interesting experience.
How old are you at this point? If you don't mind me asking?
Oh, God, sort of mid-20s at the time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Been out. I'd worked in different places before, but this is like where my career really started.
Yeah.
I had other hats on in the same role as well. So I was being asked to like stand in front of industry and update and publish quite a meaty document which described how National Grid designed and developed the gas transmission system. So that was quite terrifying at the time, but enjoyable. The document itself was quite interesting because it looked at things like legislation, environmental policy, how the commercial markets worked, how we modelled supply and demand data, and importantly, how we modelled the entire gas transmission network. So that was quite interesting. Another part of the role involved standing in front of the regulator or producing reports to help them understand what the need case was for various CapEx projects.
Nice.
So then I got bored of that, and then I sort of switched into the murky world of electricity, and I joined the electricity charging team. And one of the jobs I had there was to be the business lead for that department to implement a multi-million-pound SAP project, which was interesting. And I also coordinated a team of analysts to do the annual charging and billing obligations. So that was quite interesting. So kind of going short term, medium term, long term, and then charging. Then I had every intention of leaving National Grid, but I kind of got rubber banded back into the business by an ex-colleague who asked me to help on a very interesting project called carbon capture and storage. So that was too tempting. But the caveat was I had to come in back as a contractor. So that started my life as a consultant or contractor. Really interesting job, obviously innovative technology in a sort of quite a political landscape. It was a £1 billion competition that I was involved with, and this was really my first foray into project risk management as opposed to the modelling of risk that I did before.
Yeah,
and we did some quite sort of innovative stuff there. You know, one of the things that we had to do was to set up an enterprise risk management system specifically for the project. It also had a bolt-on Monte Carlo tool to it, so you could do QCRAs on it. And also kind of trying to push the boundaries a little bit. We were doing clever things like linking risk to individual clauses in different types of contracts to help us to sort of normalise the data in tender evaluations and things. Then the government decided to pull the £1 billion competition on it. So I then found myself in capital delivery in National Grid again. And I worked on a whole range of projects, ranging from cable projects, overhead lines, diversions, flood defences, and so on. And then my role morphed into more sort of political projects like Hinkley Point C. So I was a risk manager on that, leading the regulatory submission part of the risk piece on that, HS2. Done things like ousted various consultancies out and in-housed risk management functions, which was quite interesting at the time.
Nice.
And then I got moved on to just tell me to shut up, by the way.
No, fire away. I find this stuff fascinating.
It's a bit of a weird journey. And then I had one of the jobs that I had at Capital Delivery was to implement an enterprise risk management system, which was quite interesting. So from end to end, doing the business requirements, tender evaluation of different products, and then implementing it. And believe it or not, from start to end of getting the vendor on site, we designed, implemented, and trained people up within 3 months, which is unheard of, from what I understand. So as a risk manager, I can claim that I used 0% of my contingency, and we were on budget and on time, or before time, actually. So did that for a bit, and then went on to evolve that. So taking it from just a risk management system to try and do a bit of a risk maturity plan and trying to build risk analytics, integrating it with other systems within the business to try and improve the way the business reported on risks and stuff. And then after that, I got bored of National Grid, thought I definitely need to leave now, and joined Network Rail for a couple of years as a risk and value manager. Worked on a number of different projects like the London to Corby project, the tail end of that project, and then knee deep in the East West Rail Phase 2 project, which was quite a large project, and helping out with the target cost negotiations on that. And then more recently earlier this year in February, I joined Costain as a principal consultant. So again, in the middle of COVID, switching sectors and industries. And the reason why I joined Costain and wanted to become a consultant was I kind of missed the contracting life of being able to work for different clients. And I don't talk too much about it, but I work in defence at the moment. So I have to be a bit tight-lipped about what I do and how I do it. But it's a very, very interesting and different environment to be working in. So that's me, really.
Amazing. Amazing. Would you say it's fair to say you come from a little bit more of a technical background?
Hopefully I've illustrated that. It's not just a technical background. A lot of what I've done started off the first sort of 10 years, certainly very analytical, statistical role. And that's where I kind of learned my trade. Yeah. And then the more senior I became, and as I went into contracting, it required a lot more developing and exploiting of stakeholder skills, communication, moving into things like when implementing a risk management system, it's not just about implementing a technical system, it's about the change management plan, communications plan, setting targets, and then monitoring and measuring success, things like that. So yeah, I've had to kind of, when I was presenting to industry for National Grid, again standing in front of big industry players in London, central London, it's quite an experience. So yeah, I've had a bit of everything, really.
Amazing. And you mentioned Network Rail. I think that where yourself and Rich actually.
Oh yeah, of course, yeah. That's where we met. Yeah, I was in the Northwest and Central region, which is where Rich went as well. So yeah, that's where our paths crossed for the first time.
Brilliant. Well, Rich, don't know if you want to follow on from that and take us on a bit of a journey from your career, how you got into risk management and your journey up to this point.
Nice segue there, Pat. I suppose my journey began when I did a MSc in project management about 12 years ago, and following that I got a job at Network Rail as a project management assistant, and for about 5 years I worked through the project management grades at Network Rail. But as a project manager, I always found risk reviews really interesting, and QRAs and how that worked. And I always wanted to shadow the risk people we had. So eventually I put my money where my mouth was, and I got a job as a risk analyst. So I was able to cut my teeth in that role, working on a variety of small to large projects. And after a while, I was fortunate enough to become a risk and value manager at Network Rail, and I've been doing that for the last 5 or so years. And since I've been doing that, a really good job. You get to be exposed to all different kinds of things, like building risk frameworks and working on really big mega projects to really small but numerous maintenance ones, and the various different challenges that brings, and developing staff and risk managers of the future. So I've been on railway infrastructure for the last 11 years, and that's taken me from the pragmatic world of project management, where risks happen to you, to the kind of maybe more luxurious seat of watching risks happen to other people and trying to help them avoid them where possible, and exploiting opportunities.
Amazing. Brilliant. So, like I say, this part of the podcast I always find one of the most interesting, is sort of hearing people's backgrounds and where they've come from. I think out of everyone I've spoken to so far, there's only one guest I've had so far who sort of did risk management at uni straight after sixth form and been risk management exclusive since. So yeah, it's always really interesting to hear everyone's backgrounds. Brilliant. So thanks a lot for that, gents. So I think before we delve straight into the topic, it'd be good to give a little bit of context for our listeners. So I think it's well documented that there's overwhelming evidence to illustrate that there is a varied performance on projects, and a significant proportion of those continue to have a jaded track record. So given the discipline of risk management hasn't changed significantly in recent years, do you think that we as a risk profession should be challenging ourselves to innovate and explore new ways to improve what we do now and how we do it? So Dee, I think I'll start with you.
Interesting question. So I think I kind of have to answer your question with a question for myself and for the three of us, I suppose, really. It's really how do we measure the value of what we do within the risk profession? Because if we understand the answer to that question, then we know whether we need to improve or not. But as you've kind of touched upon, there is overwhelming evidence online, freely available, to show that projects aren't performing as well as they could be. And the trend doesn't appear to be that positive either. So when you look online and look at things like the PMI Pulse of the Profession survey that's done annually, or you look at research from McKinsey or Bent Floyberg, it's all out there. When Bent quotes, I think he's got that famous quote where he says only 0.5% of projects delivered to cost, time, and benefits, and that kind of says it all for me, really. So that provides the context that you talked about before, and risk is obviously part of that. And if you look at some of the research and some of the feedback from the respondents, they do point towards a risk management kind of area, if you like. And so reflecting on that, when you look at our profession, and I've only been in it for I suppose 20 years, if you think about when I first started risk modeling, right? But in my opinion, over the last decade or so, risk management as a profession really hasn't evolved significantly. Yes, there has been developments in QRA, quantitative risk analysis. But even then, if you think about the last decade or so in terms of policies, processes, best practice guides, there hasn't been a lot to distinguish between different professional organizations or what other companies are using. Now, the cynic in me, I might not be popular for saying this, those professional organizations have qualifications that they're promoting and selling. And they're a bit of a cash cow. So part of me thinks, where is the lack of innovation? What's not spurred that innovation? It could be that. The other part of me is thinking maybe it's about diversity of people and thought. And I don't just mean in terms of gender or ethnicity. I mean the fact that in many organizations we work in silos. So I work in a risk management discipline. I'll have a planner that works in the planning department. There'll be cost engineers that work in cost. And I haven't seen that much collaborative working across those different disciplines, because risk, as we know, cuts across all disciplines, right? And so I think another reason might be something along the lines of risk is not really embedded into our DNA as an organization or a client. it's really, we're seen as a risk function to drop in when you want to calculate contingency, and then we kind of drop back into our little box, if you like.
Yeah.
So I think there's a cultural change that's required. So yeah, I think given the scale, the cost, and the impact of things going wrong on projects and what it's costing, the public purse, if you like, and as well as private, I'm a little bit disappointed that we as a profession haven't really innovated or done anything in that space. But I do think there's a lot of potential. So trying to end my response on a positive note, I think the younger generation coming through, are because they live they've grown up with new technology and how it's evolved so rapidly throughout their sort of early years. They're a bit more data literate and a bit more trusting of technology to a certain respect. So I think, given what we're going to talk about today, I'm hoping there's opportunities to innovate and improve, and maybe we can explore some of those things.
Excellent.
I think due to the fact that often the question, can you demonstrate the value of risk management, is a difficult question to answer. I think that in itself suggests that there's room for improvement. And I suppose there's quite a simple argument for innovation in risk management, and it might be a bit blunt, but as risk practitioners, we ask our teams and our stakeholders to improve themselves and make themselves better. So surely we should do that to ourselves as well.
100%. No, I think that's really poignant, and I think that leads us on quite nicely into the topics. So, as I'm sure everybody will have noticed from the title of the episode and sort of a couple of points we've already touched on already, what we're going to be discussing today is very much around data and analytics, which I think it's fair to say until recently hasn't really been associated with risk management. But recognizing the growing popularity around data and analytics in other professions, I think it has begun to find its way into our profession. So with that in mind, I'd be really interested to hear from you both, sort of your stance on it really, and why you decided to chat about it today. I'm quite fortunate that in my previous role, I spent a lot of time speaking to sort of leaders in data and analytics, and basically exclusively worked with people in and around that profession. So yeah, really looking forward to this one. But yeah, gents, Rich, I don't know if you want to kick us off why you chose to speak about this topic today.
Yeah, it's something that I'm inherently interested in. And the reason for that is, as I've gone on a voyage of discovery as a risk practitioner, I've understood to a greater extent the benefits and the flaws of certain techniques, and we'll touch on that in a bit.
Yeah.
And my time in risk management has also overlapped with the acceleration we've seen in data science over the last 10 years. So while previous to that, we might have seen improvements in processing power, which made QRA techniques much more improved. The emergence of things like predictive analytics or big data and those kind of concepts, and being backed by the computing power to start to merge that with things like complexity science, or reference class forecasting, or machine learning and deep learning and that kind of thing. I think it creates a lot of exciting opportunities, and therefore, I was fortunate to have a line manager who several years ago said, have a look at these topics, and they planted the seed, and over the years I've dipped in and out, and it's only over the last few years where I've realized how we can harness this and how to go with my businesses that I work with. And I see it as a logical extension of the progress we've seen in other fields in what we're calling the information age, and how we can tie that up with risk information ultimately. I mean, what do you think, Deepak? What interests you about this?
I wrote down a quote somewhere. I think it's on my laptop. I think it says something like, there's a, I think it's from the MIT Sloan article, and it says something like, instead of finding a purpose for data, we should find data for a purpose. And I think they referred to it as, rather than referring it to as data-driven analytics, which is a term that I've used loads of times before, they use the term decision-driven analytics, and that really stuck in my mind. So going back to my introduction in terms of, you know, where I'm from, right? So in today's language, I would be called a data scientist in terms of what I did. You know, the technology now, like machine learning, is automating what I did manually on a regular basis. So with my background, and because I used to use data in more sophisticated ways. So when we look at risk data, it sits in a risk register and it's relatively static. But what the new technology is kind of brought to the front is how we can do more clever things with it, and how we can present the information in different ways that enables us to engage our audiences better, you know, during risk workshops or risk reviews. And I just think that the way we've looked at risk data over the last decade or so, it's very narrow. When you look at the fields in a risk register, we kind of like look at that data is literally just risk data. We don't link that information with anything else. And as we know, within risk, you know, you have a cause, you have relationships between things, and you have effects. And I think what data analytics or predictive analytics or machine learning, call it whatever you want, is now starting to demonstrate is an ability to help us to navigate some of that stuff. And I think it's not just about, I know we're going to be talking about quantification of risk, we're going to be talking about data analytics, but I think it's really about how we engage our stakeholders better, you know, improve the way we communicate and improve the way we present information so that they can make decisions in a more informed way and at the right time. And I think the way we've done it in the past, it's been relatively simple and crude. And I was just going to sort of end it by saying, well, probably should have said this earlier, but, you know, like if you look at industries out there, like the finance industry, the entertainment industry, and even the medical industry, they've been using machine learning and this new technology for years and years and years. So I do question why within the construction sector and project risk management, if you like, why we haven't sort of exploited it. And again, I come back to my personal view is this lack of diversity, lack of diverse thinking, lack of having those with, you know, that data science background embedded within infrastructure organizations to start planting the seed to get those conversations going, rather than relying on external consultancies, ironically, coming in and doing the job. So yeah, I'm really passionate about, like Rich, you know, over the years I've kind of developed a passion for it, and I don't think it's a golden bullet. I don't think it's going to solve all our problems, but let's start exploring it. And if we make mistakes, we'll make mistakes, but we need to start somewhere. And I think we just need to create an environment and a culture within businesses where they're open-minded and allow us to start presenting some of this stuff.
Yeah, I must admit, I remember when I first joined Optimize, like coming up for a year ago, coming off the back of my previous career, which was in sales and recruitment in the data and analytics industry. So by no means I'm a data scientist, but I think it was my job to have a pretty good understanding of what it could do and what it was capable of. And in the early weeks of Optimize, when I sort of realized how empirically driven risk can be, I was just baffled as to why data and analytics wasn't had a leading role in the profession. Really, I thought it was sort of a bit of a no-brainer.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, that, because the more I think about it, the more I've got different perspectives on it. And part of it, if you think about those industries that I've just mentioned, so entertainment, finance, and the medical industry, it's the nature of the data, isn't it? So some of it is really transactional, so volumes and volumes of that data being generated on a daily basis. And the way in which they code that information and structure it and how they store it is relatively straightforward, and it's been around for years. Whereas if you start thinking about risk within the construction industry space, it's different, isn't it? It's not that straightforward. And, you know, in terms of like development of like the IT infrastructure in many organizations out there, especially within the construction space, it's lagged other industries. So there are some sort of reasons to explain why it has taken so long.
I don't think it's the only parameter in which you could say the construction industry's been lagging. I'm not sure what it is about the industry as a whole, but it seems to be not the early adopting industry, shall we say.
And it is surprising, isn't it? Because, you know, going back to some of these, like you said, Rich, you've worked on some mega projects, right? And the amount of money involved and the fact that, a lot of these projects are publicly funded projects, you would think that these failures, these high profile failures or poor performance that have been kind of shared over the last decade or so, that would spur the industry to change or innovate or do something, but it hasn't been there until recently.
Fantastic, gents. Well, like I say, I think before we dive right into the detail of where data analytics could take the profession and the potential it has, I think it's probably quite important for us to establish, from a traditional sense at least, where we are currently as a profession. So I'll open this up to you both. I mean, would you like to talk us through how we do it currently?
Yeah, I mean, for me, if we looked at the tools and techniques in risk management, there's loads of them. There's lots of different ones, but if we were to pick on some, you'd probably pick on the risk register. You pick on QRAs as well, both schedule and cost or integrated, things like that. And you look at the inputs for those things, and generally they require an estimate of some sort, whether that's a cost or a schedule estimate, some assumptions that estimate is based on, and then a discussion around the risks to that, the threats and opportunities that can create variance from that estimate. And the challenges with that are, firstly, it's time consuming to put these estimates together, and therefore if they change, the process becomes time consuming again. And secondly, the fact that the quantification of risk, which is based on opinion and expert judgment, is fundamentally subjective. Risk is a social construct, and we are subject to so many different biases. There's even talk that we've got too many biases now. So we might need to rationalize our bias codex. And, humans are flawed, right? And we need to understand what the positive, negative, possible negative and positive consequences of uncertain activities are. But we're using a brain that possibly isn't, the best tool for the job. So we kind of base investment decisions and big infrastructural, reputational decisions on what could be really flawed information. But the benefits of this, and I'm not saying that they're all flawed, the benefits of this are that because our brain that we can comprehend has put it together, we can understand how we've got to the answer, and we can pick it apart and say, this is what's driving this answer. But the flip side of that is the answer could be completely wrong. So we can understand it, but the output is wrong. Whereas on the flip side, as you start to look at machine learning and stuff like that, we might not necessarily understand the output, but it could be more accurate. And it's that trade-off of those concepts which is quite interesting. So, I've done these traditional approaches for many years, and I see how they're beneficial. I also see how they're challenging. Deepak, have you got any thoughts?
A lot, but I'll try and restrain myself. Yeah, I think there's pros and cons with anything, right? So with QRA, quantitative risk analysis, for those that are not aware of it, you can have cost risk analysis or schedule risk analysis. So cost risk analysis is relatively straightforward to understand because you're looking at costs. And when we look at costs, you talk about, I like the way in which, you have that conversation around, it's not just a deterministic number that you're looking at. So there is a range around that. And I like, when we look at risks and we quantify them for a QRA, you talk about the tail end events and you talk about distributions and stuff like that. So I think that engages your audience and gets them to think about a non-static number, which is good because that kind of reflects reality. It's logical, it's scientific, which is good. It's kind of it has been deemed to be best practice for a while, and I probably certainly agree with some aspects of that. But as you were alluding to, it can be affected by the inputs. So the inputs can be biased depending upon how you've derived them. So when you're talking about building a minimum most likely value for a risk, how did you arrive at those numbers? What data, what evidence, what information did you use to support those numbers? And more often than not, it's a judgment. It's a balance between a judgment call and limited data or no data at all. And when this is where people get into the conversation of familiar projects that have been done loads and loads of times before, and unique endeavors or projects that people feel are unique. And so how do you derive those parameters for those models and those distributions? So I think, and the thing about bias is there's one thing in terms of the input to the model, but then when you crank the handle, generate the output, that's where other biases or influences come into play, like politics. It's no secret that we can produce, a scientifically generated number, which is logic and, been inputted by the business and subject matter experts and what have you. But when you produce the number and present it to some more senior people within the organisations, they're quite keen to overlay some of the numbers with their own view. So I think bias and politics and influence kind of works at the start of it and at the tail end of it as well. And I think this is where the newer technology kind of, I wouldn't say eliminates that, but it will help us to reduce some of it, and force us to tell a more transparent story in one respect. But as Rich was alluding to as well, many people have kind of considered back in the day Monte Carlo simulation a black box. I don't know what they're going to make of machine learning, because that's a bit more complicated to kind of get your head around. But they're the things that I like about it. It's on a positive note, it's scientific, kind of engages people, gets people around the table. The flip side of it, it takes a long time. It's kind of quite mandrolic, as my new colleagues like to say. Errors can creep in as well. So there's a lot of manual handovers and interfaces, and data quality can be an issue as well. So forget bias or anything like that, just general data quality, where the data comes from and how it's been input, can be an issue as well. So there are pros and cons with the way we do things at the moment. And let's not forget, within large major infrastructure projects, people might be familiar with quantitative cost risk analysis, but there are many organizations out there that are just using risk registers and qualitative bandings to quantify their risks or assess them. So there is still a broad range of tools and techniques being used out there by businesses. So it's not consistent by any means.
So do you think the cons with the way we currently do things outweigh the pros at the moment?
Yeah, I'm going to be brave and say there's the balance of cons versus pros isn't adequate to justify not innovating further. I think there's enough evidence to demonstrate that there are flaws in traditional processes that would suggest, okay, well, it's best practice. What we've got now, that doesn't mean that will be the best practice forever. Therefore, we should be open-minded as a profession to explore new avenues.
I think it's a brilliant answer.
That's a fact. I'm so glad you went first. And I think it's a really good answer, because I think me and Rich agree on this as well. I think there is no one golden bullet or one size fits all, and I think we're moving into a space now where historically you'd have in any industry, in any discipline, you have camps that set themselves up, and they tend to be at extremes. Whereas I think now within our industry, there is a recognition that there is space for more than just one tool or technique, and at different points in a project's life cycle. So we might touch upon, reference class forecasting, which is a buzzword at the moment. I mean, I used to do reference class forecasting when I used to build statistical models back in the day. So for me, I can see the value in them, and I used to go down to quite a granular level when you're looking at plant and machinery. But from a project perspective, you can start high level or sort of work your way down. And I think we've had conversations, me and Rich, about how maybe something like reference class forecasting is more useful further earlier on in a project, where there's a greater degree of uncertainty around, risks and things like that. And then the further you get into a project where more information, more intelligence and becomes available, that's the point at which you might want to crank the handle on a QRA, a schedule risk analysis or cost risk analysis, where it's a bit more intelligent or based upon numbers that make more sense.
Excellent. Perfect. So I think that wraps up quite nicely around where we're at currently. So Dee, I think from an innovation perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what is really driving the need case for change. I think we touched on a couple of things there, but is there anything else that you'd like to touch on?
Yeah, so I think we already talked about the need case for change in terms of the evidence out there. So we talked about the research that's out there and some of the interesting statistics that are there. But if we get closer to now, today, if you think about what's happened over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've had COVID, and it's led to some interesting developments and attitudes and expectations. So if you look at things like Project Speed, which has been well publicised in the UK, there's some sort of famous quotes out there in some of the literature which says, we want to halve the time and cost on sort of railway or sort of publicly funded projects. And if you think about it, it's all right to say that. We've been kind of like trundling along using our risk management tools and techniques to try and reduce risk exposure on projects. And I'm not saying risk management is solely to blame, but as an industry, we've not done very well. So this is only going to put more pressure on people, because organizations, projects, you name it, because already we're seeing within organizations that me and Rich are aware of, processes and policies are changing. The attitude and risk appetite is changing. The nature of how we do work. So whereas before work was linear and sequential, now there's more of an appetite to do activities in parallel, which can do all sorts of interesting things to the risk profile for projects. So I think more recently with COVID and the effects of that, it's brought it home even more that we need a way to do things quicker. So not only deliver projects quicker, but do what we do as a risk profession quicker and more efficiently. And again, I go back to the new technology out there. One of the benefits, whilst they do have drawbacks, is that it can do things quicker when set up correctly. So before performing a quantitative risk analysis or schedule risk analysis required a lot of handovers and a lot of data, and took quite a long time. From end to end, from starting the process to producing a report can take weeks or days. So if that can be done at a push of a button, with some caveats, then that's certainly a need case for change, isn't it? It sort of justifies the case for change.
Yeah, definitely.
I think, as a risk manager on publicly funded public infrastructure projects, I think you can argue that there's always a need for improvement, because ultimately we're talking about taxpayers' money that could be used to fund nurses. It could be used to fund hospitals, schools, teachers, whatever. So every pound we save and every extra minute of benefit we get out of projects can be used to improve the UK PLC or any country or the world even. So there is a real kind of moral and social incentive to deliver projects more effectively. And, therefore to have resistance to that seems a little bit absurd to me. But yeah. I can appreciate why people have reservations. I remember an anecdote where the people on the first train were frightened because they weren't used to traveling at 30 miles an hour. To us, that would seem patently absurd now. But, if there's this big steam contraption propelling you at velocities that you weren't used to, then that would be unfamiliar and there would be a trust barrier to get through. And I think it's a similar concept to where we are now. But I feel quite passionate that, these technologies and the approaches are at least an attempt for us to get through this kind of productivity problem that we have on infrastructure projects.
Yeah, and I think just to reiterate that point I made before, we're talking about data, we're talking about tools and technology, but it's not just about technology. We're humans, we're using these tools, and we contribute to running them and trying to interpret, and we're responsible or accountable for taking actions as a result of the outputs. So there's a lot to be spoken about around the human side of things, which we may touch upon later on possibly. But
yeah,
it's not just about the technology.
Cool. Perfect. So in terms of these tools and techniques, then how are they evolving currently? I know we're going to touch a little bit more on the future a little bit down the line, but how are these tools and techniques evolving at the moment?
So I thought, a buzzword at the moment, it has been for a few years, is machine learning. A lot of people talk about AI, artificial intelligence, which is quite a broad term, but I don't like to get caught up in sort of definitions or anything. But machine learning is the buzzword, and it's basically allowing computers to sort of explore data, try and identify relationships in data that you can find, and then extrapolate in the future to try and build predictive models or forecasts. It's as simple as that, really. And I think that's where things are heading. So I'd call it an evolution. It is a bit of a revolution as well, but I call it an evolution because I used to do data science, 20 years ago when I first started out. And I was doing multiple regression modeling, looking at correlation, Monte Carlo. And yes, the technology uses different statistical and mathematical techniques slightly, but the overall concept, the overall sort of aim is still the same, and how to apply the technology. But the fundamental thing is it's that it's quicker, it's automated, and you're not spending countless hours getting hold of data, having to, I spent hours, days, weeks, 20 years ago trying to get data into a format that I could do something with it. The data quality was really poor. There was missing data. I think we've come a long way in recent years. A lot of organisations are now building the IT infrastructure to make some of those data quality issues and accessibility less of an issue. There's a lot of infrastructure organisations are building data lakes where they're sucking information out now into Power BI and Tableau and all sorts of fancy reporting tools. So I think we've come a long way, but ultimately we're speeding up the process for what we used to do manually in data science, and I think that's the kind of evolution, really.
I think for me, on top of that, it's really a question is being posed about the tools that we currently use. For example, Gantt charts, and if we look at multi-billion truly complex projects and programs, can we really understand the complexity of that by looking at a Gantt chart? And I would suggest that you can't, or that it's very difficult to do that. So I think part of this is also the development of technologies that allows us to look at the complexity of these kind of projects in a new way. And that might be taking a Gantt chart and translating it into a kind of network diagram where you understand where the sensitive kind of nodes are in the network, and encouraging ourselves to look at how we build projects in a different way and what are the real sensitive areas. Like we might look at sensitivity analysis in some of our existing tools and techniques in a different way of visualizing that, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think about the thing about this new technology. So again, that some of the techniques are not new, but it's what I used to do manually. So what I do like about the technology is it's not siloing. It's not just restricting itself to one data set. So it will, if it's got access to P6 schedule data, cost data, health and safety data, engineering data, it will mine that data and look for relationships in that information. Obviously, this thing around the boundaries between what the human should be doing and what the algorithms or the computer should be doing needs some sort of careful consideration, because you can marry ice cream cells with temperatures in Australia halfway around the world, and you might see a link there. I don't know, but need to use a bit of common sense and judgment around that. But I like the fact that it's using more than one data set. So those data silos are kind of broken down, and you can kind of look for relationships between other variables. Because when you look at risk and you start doing root cause analysis, it becomes quite evident that many things are related to many things, and many things influence many things. And one cause can create two risks or two impacts or three impacts. And I think, like Rich was saying, there are now tools out there which are starting to help the risk profession explore those relationships better. I won't name any particular software vendors out there, but I did recommend one recently on a LinkedIn post. So there are better tools out there already which are helping us to visualize these relationships and explore them with our stakeholders. And I think that works really well, because what I remember when I came to Network Rail, one of the first few projects I worked on, there was this, you get those wall-based whiteboards where you can sort of doodle around, and that's what I was doing. I went away from the risk register, and I started doing like a mind mapping type exercise. And I think that's where we need to get to. What I like about some of these new tools out there is that they encourage more participation and interaction with stakeholders. So when you ask a question, you can kind of like follow the breadcrumb trail through rather than just looking at a static risk register. And I think we're getting into that space now where we're starting to experiment. While you be brave to, there were some early adopters that are now starting to explore some of this stuff. And I remember when I was working on East West Rail Phase 2, which was quite a large project, without going into too much of the detail, I used Power BI. So I used like the network map add-in, which enabled you to connect links and nodes and things like that, because there were some really complex commercial relationships within the target cost contract, and it helped a non-technical audience navigate a lot of information on one page, and you could kind of zoom in, drill out, you could click on links, move them around and all that kind of stuff. And I think that being able to touch and move things, that interactive nature of those visualizations is really useful, and gets a lot of buy-in from the attendees and stuff.
I think that's a really good point, actually, because traditionally you could look at a lot of risk processes as linear. So if you go back to good old IT kind of data, information, knowledge, and that kind of thing, and cause, risk, effect, and I think the taxonomy of risk, how we got used to talking about risk, is very one or two dimensional, and the idea of introducing these tools allows us to look at things in different ways, in three dimensions, and ultimately it allows us to think creatively, because projects don't get toppled by the risks you see coming, do they? They get toppled by the ones you don't see coming. Sorry, I've started on the sound bites now. And
I've been waiting for that for the last half an hour.
Yeah, and being able to use different tools, like what we might do in workshops now, we're doing pre-mortems or things like that allow us to look at risk in a new way. And similarly, these kind of analytics-based approaches, by merging together different information sources, or machine learning, where algorithms might interpret a problem differently to us, or get different insights, it allows us to see risks in a new way, which might enable us to manage them more effectively.
Yeah. In terms of the next question, I've got a couple of things. Something that just mentioned in there, Rich, has sort of spurred another one. So I'll ask that one first. Do you think, because I've been quite fortunate to have used some of the tools and stuff that you guys mentioned earlier, in terms of like interactive workshops and sort of really cool technology in that respect. I've been in risk management for nearly a year, and I've still not done a risk review in person. So do you think that COVID and the current climate has in some aspects accelerated the need for this sort of technology?
So this might be the first time that Vladimir Lenin has been quoted in a risk management podcast. But Lenin said that some decades happen in weeks and some weeks happen in decades. And I think COVID is definitely the former, because while we might have had quite a nebulous discussion about the virtual workspace, and, funnily enough, things like Zoom existed before COVID. Exactly. They just weren't particularly popular. It has really accelerated working in the virtual environment. I don't think it's necessarily accelerated some of the other approaches in terms of machine learning, because I think there's generally been a friction there anyway. But especially in terms of the accessibility of these conversations that we're having, and the technologies that we can use, online to facilitate workshops, which is really interesting to hear that from you, Pat, because I'm not sure about you, Deepak, but when I had to switch to facilitating in a virtual environment, it was like a different skill set, because I was used to interpreting the entire body language, not just this, and all the etiquette and protocol. You had to be more stringent with that.
Well, honestly, like I say, I've risk management a year. I've only ever done virtual. I'd consider myself quite confident when doing that, and I consider myself quite competent. I think the first time I'd do it in front of people in a room, I think I'd be racked with nerves. It's strange how it goes, isn't it? It's just a shame that I guess some organisations have sort of taken the plunge into slightly more modern tools out of necessity rather than innovation and
I think when COVID first kicked in and we kind of got forced to all go online and stumble our way through Teams and Zooms and stuff like that, I think it was a bit chaotic and like trying to figure out how to read people. So me and Rich have been used to workshops with 20, 30 people and trying to read body language. And I think good risk managers, going back to that human side of things, we're good at reading people. We're good at, hopefully good at communication and trying to, there's a art to facilitation in terms of speeding things up, slowing things down, muting someone physically when they're there, that kind of thing. And there was no training available. You can't, there wasn't like an off-the-shelf tool that you could say, here you go, guys, just go on this course and you'll be good at facilitating on Zoom. But I do think now that we're in this world, I think increasingly we're going to have to get used to it. And, it is worthwhile understanding how to facilitate workshops online. So I would say you're probably ahead of the curve a little bit. If you come into it and you're comfortable with it, and you've probably got some good practice to share.
Yeah, like I say, I know I sort of say I'd be racked with nerves. I think in terms of sort of delivering risk workshops to groups and stuff, I'd sort of take to it as well as I've taken to it in the virtual world. But I think it'd almost be like doing a completely different, like something.
Do you know what the interesting thing is? It's weird. So when we all went online, something happened which I was really happy about. So I'd been meaning to shadow people because I wanted to understand what different projects were like, from a risk workshop perspective. There were different, I think I sat in one of Rich's as well, because within Network Rail, they do risk and value management, and value management was quite new to me at the time. And so I was trying to figure out, what's this all about? How do you apply the tools, the processes, the techniques? How do you facilitate people during that workshop? How do you get the timing right? And it opened up all those opportunities like the flick of a switch, So I volunteered myself, saying, look, if anyone wants to sit at the back of the virtual bus and just be a passenger and see how it's done, you can do that. So it created new opportunities to learn for me. So I thought I really welcomed it.
Amazing. Brilliant. So just on the last bit for me, really, then, in terms of the innovation piece. So I think we've sort of touched very much on the sort of benefits of introducing these tools and techniques. I mean, from my perspective, I don't know how similar it would be in this particular instance, but having spoken to a lot of business leaders who are hiring in data and analytics in my previous career, there was a lot of business leaders who sort of would just throw money at data and analytics and sort of expect it to start saving them or making them money, whatever the motivation was. I suppose they're just doing it because they see other organizations doing it, but they don't really have any understanding of why, what, or how. That's just a sort of an example that I can think on, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that as well, in terms of sort of drawbacks and challenges of this new technology coming into the profession.
I think there's currently a lack of understanding about where humans come into it, and we keep on saying, "Oh, we'll talk about humans in a bit," because it's such a fundamental element, that human interface, that you end up touching on it all the time. And I think there's a real misunderstanding there in terms of some kind of Terminator-esque vision of a machine learning project manager who's going to take over the world and make all our decisions for us. And I think there's an education piece that needs to happen, where we're saying, the objective's the same, giving you information to make the best decisions you can, to make the best projects you can. It's just the information comes in a different way. and the method of getting that information is different. And similarly, I think, we talked about there being quite a polarized debate about these kind of approaches. Are you traditional, or are you a lunatic futurist, or whatever? And the honest answer is they're complementary. And any of these approaches needs a human at the end of it to make a judgment, because it's the judgment that is the creative human element of the process. And AI or whatever can't do that. And they also can't sit in front of the public select committee. So, I think one of the drawbacks is currently the lack of understanding as to the context of these tools and the real benefits of them. And I think there's a lot of people and a lot of organizations who are going through that process at the moment. So I don't think that will continue to be a drawback, but I think it is a challenge at the moment.
Do you feel...
it's an interesting one, isn't it?
Sorry, go ahead, Deepak.
No, it's all right, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of other potential drawbacks, you feel like there might be risk professionals listening to this podcast who, I don't know, they might be well into the career, they might be 10 years into the career, and they've always done things a certain way, and there might be a little bit of a fear of the unknown about these new tools and techniques, and even for organizations to be able to train their employees on this stuff. Do you think that's a potential drawback?
I think it's just that's normal life, isn't it? New technology comes about. Rich can probably quote some more interesting, examples from hundreds of years ago and stuff like that. But I think for me, it's just normal. It's, new technology comes along, a new process comes along, which does things quicker. You either adapt and go with it or you don't. I think that the interesting thing for me is going back to the fact that this new technology can do things a lot quicker. So we're not talking about making decisions. We're just saying, analyze the information, we'll caveat it, we'll still allow the human to look at it. But previously, what would have taken me, a day and a half to do, from getting the data to cranking the handle to producing an output, if that can be done in half an hour, what I think the real question for us as a risk professional is, what are you going to do with all that time? How do you demonstrate you as a human being, as a risk and value manager, are still adding value? And so I think that's the thing that I think people aren't really thinking about at the moment. And I don't think either they don't want to think about it, or they're not aware that it's coming, but it is coming. And I think, as soon as some of these early adopting organizations start seeing the value in this new technology, it's going to become a reality. And then we'll start looking at organizations saying, oh, we can make a saving here. So how do we then justify our role? And I think there is space for us, but I think we need to evolve. So those are what I'd say to those people that are, resistant to change for whatever reason, just start looking online, try and understand the new technology, because I think it's going to only help us to do our job better, and it will allow us time to spend more time what as humans are better at doing. Like Rich, he's a great communicator. He can spend more time sitting down with the project team, helping them go through the analysis, rather than spending half of his time getting the data and cranking the handle in the tools. And I think the one thing that I've been thinking about recently is I'd want to invest that time that I get back learning more about that domain knowledge, because I think we're kind of getting a bit ahead of ourselves a little bit by saying the technology is going to speed things up, it's going to produce a nice analysis. But I think that without that context, that domain knowledge, I think some of that's missed. And I think we as risk practitioners need to spend more time trying to not become engineers or experts, but at least have a certain level of domain knowledge. I've just started in this new job, and I know nothing about it, and I know nothing about the industry. And I've got the technical skills, so I can do QRAs, Monte Carlo, all that kind of stuff. But I don't know anything about build strategy and stuff like that. So I'm trying to invest time doing that. And I think there's more scope for us to add more value in that way, I think.
What I would like to see is, that there are organizations out there who are developing what you might call virtual assistants, who would be able to do, that would be able to sort through various sources of data and put together an information pack that might take us hours to do. And what, as you say, Deepak, what do we do with those hours? And I think we have a choice to either see that as a threat or see it as an opportunity. And my natural inclination would be, well, I can spend more time on the introspection of models and outputs and how I would communicate that and how I would recommend action plans, rather than spending 4 hours fixing a schedule or something like that, which is let's say it's a necessary evil, and it's just that mindset thing. Change often comes. My current phone is irrecognizable from the first mobile phone I had, and I went to a TED talk a few years ago, and someone said, isn't it funny how when you ask people to change, they're quite reluctant, but when you ask people to innovate, it sounds really positive. And it makes me wonder, what's the difference between those? Why do we have different relationships with that? So is it change or is it innovation? So and I think that's a really important question for risk practitioners and project practitioners, because this is happening across the project space. Really one for them to consider.
Amazing. Fascinating. Thanks, Rich. So just moving on into the future then, really, I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, Rich, but as everyone will have noticed in the title of the episode, we have added the phrase friend, not foe, when it comes to data and analytics and risk management. So as we do look into the future of the profession, gents, how might this new technology change the role of the risk manager?
Well, I think we've touched upon it a little bit when we were talking about what do you do with that extra time that you've got. So for me, it's about I'm keen to build a level of domain knowledge that helps me to, when I'm looking at the data, it's not alien to me. So it kind of makes sense. There's some sort of high level principles that I understand about it. But also, again, going back to this human side, interacting with people, presenting information to different audiences, rather than just having an official risk workshop. Now we've got, specific bits of information that we can go and target a smaller group and focus on, what is the risk? Do we think it's a risk? How do we be proactive and mitigate those risks? Because again, we're talking a lot about quantification and a lot about technology, but 90%, I don't know, majority of risks, if you worked in this space before, they're the typical risks that pop up. You should be doing something about it. So for me, it's about going back to that human side, communicating, engaging people, presenting useful information to people. So the other thing that I see is a potential blurring of the boundaries between different roles. So you've talked specifically about the risk manager, but if you think about what a planner should be doing, a risk manager should be doing, a project manager should be doing, for me, this new technology starts kind of blurring some of the boundaries a little bit. I still think there's a place for all three, but going back to this concept that Rich talked about, the AI assistant or whatever, that's taking away a lot of the grunt work. People are going to have a lot more time on their hands, and so would there be more blurring of the boundaries? I'm not sure. It's just a question that I've got in my mind. I haven't really thought about it, but the planners provide the schedule. We input that into the Monte Carlo model, produce an SRA output, and the project manager looks at the output. How is that going to change with new technology and how we speed up the process? What do you think, Rick?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because you're looking at loads of different potential future states, aren't you? And if we take grunt work out of your job, which is X%, and that frees up X% of someone's job, and we do that across 10 people, that frees up a certain number of people. So does that mean, therefore, that we can join together some aspects of these roles so we can then deliver more stuff? Or does it mean that our roles might evolve into kind of, rather than data kind of miners and putting all that stuff together in reporting spreadsheets, we actually become data corrallers, where we have algorithms that do this, and we audit that kind of stuff. Or, my kind of dream scenario as a risk manager has been to make myself redundant by, integrating risk into all the different functions. So we don't have a risk page in our monthly report. We have all the different sources of information that include risk when they are put together. So actually, if the use of these tools means that risk as a concept and as a profession becomes integrated in the other parts of project team roles, with project manager, commercial planner, whatever, and we end up with this super risk manager that just happens to have project management as the title. I think that's a wonderful place to be. And I think, when we look at all the risk management standards and enterprise risk management and things like that, they all talk about integrating risk management. So what better way to integrate it than to embed it default into the tools that our project practitioners will have?
Yeah, really, really interesting point, that. And, how long have we had risk managers for and the profession for? Not that long in the history of things, right? So, it does make me think, what were we doing before then? Regardless of project performance, right, which hasn't necessarily improved. But I do like that, and I think I agree with Rich, and it sounds really weird to say it, but I think I said it earlier on in the podcast. What we should be doing is embedding the principles of good practice risk management across every department, every function. That mindset about understanding what a risk is and how to mitigate it. It's not. I don't see that as just a function. I think it should be part of how we make decisions. I mean, we do it as human beings, right? Outside of work every day, we look at risks and we identify them. And as a parent of two young kids, I'm constantly telling them to hold the handrail and all that kind of stuff, right? So, I think that's the future. I think eventually, hopefully, if we do our jobs correctly in a few years' time, we should be making everyone a good risk manager, really.
Fascinating. Thanks, gents. So something that I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on is around the concept of Parkinson's law. So for any of our listeners who aren't familiar with this is essentially an adage that says work expands so as to fill the time available for its completion. So just to put that into layman's terms, for example, if you're given a week for a task which should only take a day to complete, it often unnecessarily stretch that task right the way to the end of the week. So the question for you both is, if we make better use of data to develop our baseline, so for example, reference class forecasting, as we've mentioned, if our baseline becomes our post-risk position, how do we avoid falling foul of this said Parkinson's law?
Well, I'd like to jump in and say that Parkinson's law takes a very dim view of humanity, and I would challenge whether it's always correct. And I get the concept, but maybe it's a little bit extreme. I suppose my answer to this, bearing in mind some of the kind of concepts and tools that we talked before, is the idea of kind of pre and post risk. So we say, okay, an activity might take one day, but it might take the whole week, and at what point is it realistic to plan? Do we plan for the worst case, that we got a dim view of humanity, or do we plan for how much we think it should really take?
Yeah.
And I'd actually challenge that and turn it on its head and say, why don't we take the risk out of it and say, actually, how much has this thing taken in the past on similar projects? So rather than say, let's try and calculate the uncertainty associated with it, knowing that if we give someone some contingency, they will use it, which is, a cited phenomenon. We could say, well, how long has this taken us in the past? And what is the range of outcomes and outputs that we have witnessed with these kinds of activities? So rather than giving people the invitation to use the time, let's say, well, what have people done in the past?
Yeah, and again, I actually don't see this as anything different to how things have been in the past. So, this is all about building contingency into baselines, right? And saying, this is how much time you've got, or this is how much it's going to cost. And I think I agree. I was going to say something similar to what you talked about, because I was kind of triggered by the buzzword reference class forecasting there. But I think, again, sometimes I think we get blitzed by the analytics and the data. And whilst quantification and analysis is useful, what actually spurs someone into action? That's a question I've got. Because if most of the quantification, typically they'll call a risk guy and say, can you crank the handle? And because it's to do with early funding for a project, if you like. But I think the earlier that we intervene and take action, the better chances we've got of success. So regardless of what the numbers are showing, regardless of the benchmarks, I think it's like common sense. Here's an activity that you need to do. How long do we think it's going to take? Rich has already mentioned the minimum, most maximum, or historical data. I think the focus should be around what are you going to do about it. And I do think that, some of the analytics focus too heavily on quantification of the impact. I think some of the stuff that certainly I've been experimenting with over the last few years is around producing analysis around the mitigation of risks, and I think that's a space where we could probably explore a bit more. So things like, looking at things like, I don't know, when you have like your risk burn down, for example, or whatever people call it, over time, your risk profile, usually people look at expiry dates of risks. Well, should you not really be using the last target date of the mitigation action that you have against that risk? So if you've got 5 mitigation actions and one finishes on the 22nd of September, should that not be the expiry date for the risk? So there's lots of different ways of looking at it, but my mind's kind of like sort of exploring those at the moment. So I think ultimately it's we talk about pre-risk, post-risk and all that, but I think that the focus should come back to what are we going to do about it, because ultimately it's about ownership, it's about accountability, it's about understanding how we motivate people into action. So you talked about people filling up that time. Well, how do we motivate them to do it quicker or avoid those risks?
I think it comes down to culture, doesn't it? No.
Yeah, it comes down to culture, but I think it's kind of like, you can talk about culture all day long, but it's like,
I know. Tell me about it.
How do you motivate someone to do something, sooner rather than later? Just going back to this gap filling time, some of us are procrastinators. When we think about something, we want to push something back as far as you can. And I think it's like trying to understand using analytics. So there are things going on out there in the analytics field around how to motivate people to get on with a task. I think that's something we can probably explore in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks, gents. So just final point from me, really. So I think we've been flirting with the question of the human factor throughout the podcast and never really sort of delving right into it. So, Rich, I think you touched on this briefly, but I'd be interested to hear both of your thoughts on this. So in terms of the human element and sort of managing risk. So as we mentioned earlier, sort of we've always looked at data when managing risks, and it's always been quite an empirically driven exercise. However, expertise, leadership, that human factor on how we should think about risk really weighs in. So I suppose there's 2 parts to this question, really. So firstly, there's obviously the human element that we touched on earlier, in that data and analytics automation could potentially improve on. So, reducing human error from unconscious bias or just general failures in human nature. But then on the flip side of the coin, it's how far can we take this? So obviously, despite its flaws, the human element is arguably one of the most fundamental aspects in managing risk. I guess the question is, how far does data analytics actually go to improve the profession, and how much human interaction will still be needed and how much can be substituted? Rich, I know you touched on it earlier, but I don't know if you've got any more thoughts on that.
To paraphrase someone in this podcast, well, it all comes down to culture, and I could talk about that all day long. But it does, because it is a culture and the framework and the context of an organization that will draw the line between where these processes stop and where human judgment comes in. And that line will be drawn at slightly different points, but I am convinced that line will exist. in any environment where these tools are used. I don't think we'll have, as I said before, like Terminator-esque characters robotically making judgments on publicly funded infrastructure, at least in this decade, or maybe in this century. I don't know.
I was going to say, I'm sure that's what they said in Terminator, Rich.
Well, yeah. Be careful. But the fact is, because of the social need for these kinds of projects, or the profit motive behind, having a healthy supply chain, there needs to be an accountability for decision making, and that accountability needs to sit with a project director or a human of some sort. And we need to see these approaches as a way of making that decision making more effective, not as a replacement or an either or.
Yeah.
So, in conclusion, I think how far it goes can vary depending on how a organization wants to interpret that. But I think there'll always be that kind of line in the sand where we hand over to an accountable body, which would be a human. I feel all kind of space age with those sentences.
No, like I say, I think when I was sort of weighing up the topic, that was sort of one of the first things that came to mind. So I thought it'd be a good place to finish. But D, I don't know if you've got any.
I think Richard's always kind of articulates himself really well. I think the bit that I'd add to that is, and we talked about how it improves the profession and how much can be substituted, but just thinking it through, maybe I'm going off on a tangent here a little bit, but with so many moving parts on a project, so much data is being generated, and if we're going into this world where a lot of that data is now being measured, monitored, and sometimes that can go, the granular level can go down to an individual. I think there are some kind of like other sort of challenging sort of subject areas that we probably need to touch upon, like ethics and what is ethical, and how say for example someone makes a decision and they rely on the output from the machine. Are they accountable? Can you blame the computer afterwards? When you have that post-mortem and you're looking at stuff, how is the organization, going back to culture, how is the organization going to treat that individual, that person who had to make the decision? So for me, again, it comes down to accountability, responsibility. We've talked about sponsors. We've talked about, people on the shop floor having to make decisions on a daily basis. And more often than not, a lot of these decisions are going to have to be made, prior to big ones being made. And then when you look back historically at how those decisions and how you got to where you got to, I do, part of me does worry about it, we talk about like new technology, like machine learning. Well, another part of that technology, which is already being used by some sort of innovators out there, are things like NLP, natural language processing. So already, and it's being used in industries, to be fair, already, analyzing what people are saying in conversations, and how that's being captured. And I know some systems are already starting to say, hey, look, project manager, you might be aware of this particular area or activity because, people are talking about it in a potentially negative way, or there are kind of alarm bells ringing. So I think, how will that impact individuals working on a project? Is that likely to increase their performance and motivation? Is that likely to affect their mental health, knowing that they're being monitored, in this new kind of like future state, a bit like the Chinese do with all their people and all those cameras and technology out there? I don't know. So it brings up more questions than answers, unfortunately. But I think we just need to, like Rich was saying, I think there's not enough being done at the moment to educate people at different levels within the organization, whether it's, your sponsors or your directors or project managers. I know from experience, I can say hand on my heart, the last 3, 4, 5 years, hardly any of that's taking place. And the people are aware of this technology. People are starting to experiment with it, but I think we need to get ahead of the curve a little bit and try and think about how we're going to have those conversations and what it means for us day to day.
And it's completely our responsibility as project leaders to create that environment and to set out those roles and responsibilities. Computers can't do it. Computers can't build culture. They can do maths dead quick, but they can't tell us what's right or wrong.
Boom! Another sound.
Boom! There you go. I was waiting to get that one in.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I can go now. But we talk about being able to eliminate biases. You can write algorithms with biases in them. So while at the moment we might peer review the decisions to fund projects, we could be peer reviewing and auditing the bias in algorithms to say, actually, are we just programming these tools to make the same mistakes we did? So we can talk down the risk and talk up the benefits of projects so we can get them greenlit. And once they're greenlit, we sunk too much money in them to cancel them halfway through. There are those pitfalls as well.
It's interesting because we talk about algorithms being biased and the traditional forms being biased, but even things like we talked about reference class forecasting. So when you produce your data set that you're building to be your reference class, how did you do that? Who's responsible for it? What was the logic and rationale behind building that set to base your forecasts against and things like that? So yeah, it's there in everything that we do, and I think it will be there in the future. But I think we just need to start that education, and like Rich knows, I've been kind of like reading up on this stuff now, and I try and write a few articles to share what I've learned as I'm going along my sort of learning journey, because I think it's in our best interest to start trying to understand the basics around what this technology is, how it works, how I might fit into that space in the future. I think it's really important, and I'm hoping this podcast will kind of sort of spur. And there are, I think, there is a recognition now. I mean, both Rich and myself are members of the APM, and I know that they're now starting to recognise the importance of data analytics, project data analytics, whatever you want to call it. And so the conversation has started, and I'm hoping through these organisations, these thought-leading organisations out there, they start, stimulating that conversation and getting us thinking, and maybe asking some of those difficult questions that we're maybe too afraid to ask within our own parent organisations.
I remember, Deepak, you wrote an article about algorithmic leaders that people can access on LinkedIn. And, that terminology was new to me when I read it. And it really resonated with me, because we need people who are open-minded and progressive, who will create the environment for these things to flourish. Because if we try and grow these in a hostile, frictionful environment, then that we're not going to realize their benefits as quickly as we could.
I was just going to say, I think it'd be fascinating to come back to this podcast in 5 years, 10 years, and see how far we've come. Maybe we could
see how wrong we were.
Rich is going to look about 15 years younger with his new avatar.
Maybe we could get one of the Terminator risk manager robots on as well.
Yeah.
But no, gents, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed it. I mean, I think I know the answer from both of you, but data and analytics and risk management, friend or foe? Where are we going?
Yeah, it's two thumbs up from me.
Two thumbs up.
2 thumbs up.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for your time today, gents. And for anybody that's watching this on the video content, they'll probably see the how dark it is outside. We're actually recording this. It's currently 10 to 8 on a Friday evening, so it's a wild one for the three of us tonight. But no, like I say, couldn't thank you more. You both enough for coming on, especially at this time. So, just final point from me, and where I end all the podcasts with the brilliant guests that come on. So, Deepak, we'll start with yourself. So, if you were able to give yourself a piece of advice, what's starting out in your career in risk management that you know now that you didn't know then, what would that piece of advice be?
I've got three bits of advice. I've been thinking about this because you told me in advance. I think
on the spot.
It's not that live.
Exactly.
I think the one thing, if you notice when I describe my career path, I jumped around quite a lot, and I think you mentioned that many of your people that you've recorded in the past have had varied careers as well. So my advice would be to try and move around. There are, I think, increasingly there's so many risk qualifications, whether it's postgraduate or graduate, and I think it's very easy to slip into that profession and stay within it and be a risk analyst and then an manager and whatever afterwards. I think it's important I talked about domain knowledge, and I think different perspectives, and I found that being a data analyst, a project manager, doing an IS project or doing a CapEx project and all that kind of stuff, it's really opened my eyes to different ways of doing things. And a lot of the ideas that I come up with at work have been driven by that diversity of thought and diversity of people and mingling with different things. The other thing I'd say linked to that as well is network. So if you, rather than waiting for a risk workshop to turn up, meet these people, be proactive, spend 15 minutes, 10 minutes in a virtual, coffee conversation or something like that. It's so easy now to do it online. Just start building up a network with people, whether it's online on LinkedIn or whether it's at work, because again, you're putting yourself, allowing yourself to be exposed to different perspectives. And the last thing I'll say is obviously listen to this podcast and other equivalent podcasts out there, because again, certainly during lockdown, I really took to listening to podcasts, and I've shared some of them online. I'll share this one as well now.
Appreciate the plug.
You can, learning, you can learn something. I've been quite critical of postgraduate qualifications, but, you can learn something in a textbook and you can sit in an exam and do it, but there's nothing like listening to someone else's real experiences and interpretation and feelings about how things have been on their sort of journey. So I'd certainly recommend listening to as many podcasts as you can.
Exactly. And that's precisely why I started this, to be honest, is like you say, you can go through as much theory as you like and as many textbooks as you like, but real unique first-hand experience is invaluable. And to be able to have a platform to share that and listen to it, whether you're at the start of your career or you're a senior leader, is a great opportunity. So, Rich, same for yourself. Piece of advice, fire away.
Well, just off the top of my head, I would say that, tongue-in-cheek, risk management is a really diverse, versatile, multifaceted profession, and you can go in so many different directions with it. Yep. And when I started as a risk professional, a few years ago, I didn't think I'd be having conversations like this at all. Yeah. And, I've been able over the years to harness the side of my character that's quite playful, quite creative, and marry that with risk concepts and to achieve the objectives of what I've needed to do or my team's needed to do with our stakeholders. So my advice I would be to myself would be to be open-minded about the potential opportunities that there are and seek the ones that appeal to your personality, whether that is someone who's fantastic with data like Deepak is, and I'm forever learning little nuggets from him, or someone who likes communicating or storytelling, which is another really important part of risk management, yeah. Or somewhere in between, whether that's the introspection of models or whether it's providing constructive challenge and things like that. All these different things are an equally important part of risk management. Have a good think about what is really important to you and what will kind of fulfill your soul and make you happy in your work, and seek out those opportunities. Love
that. Sound advice. Brilliant. So just as we round it off, then, if anybody wants to get in touch with either of you in terms of whether it's to talk all things data or risk or anything that we've touched on today, what would be the best way for them to get in touch?
It would be LinkedIn, and my name is here. Richard Bendall-Jones.
Yeah, same here. Just go on LinkedIn.
Cool. I'll tag you both. I'll attach links to your profiles in the podcast notes for this episode anyway. But yeah, like I say, gentlemen, thanks so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, fascinating chat, and looking forward to the next one.
No worries. Cheers, mate. Thanks a lot.
Enjoyed it. It's been really fun. Thank you.
Yeah. No worries, guys. Take care. Thanks for listening, everyone. All the best. Bye-bye.